The Trumpet of the Swan by 𝐒𝐵𝐻𝐿. Chapter 5. Louis. One evening a few weeks later, when the cygnets were asleep, the swan said to the cob, "Have you noticed anything different about one of our children, the one we call Louis?" "Different?" replied the cob. "In what way is Louis different from his brothers and sisters? Louis looks all right to me. He is growing well, he swims and dives beautifully, he eats well, he will soon have his flight feathers." "Oh, he looks good all right," said the swan, "and heaven knows he eats enough. He's healthy and bright and a great swimmer. But have you ever heard Louis make any sound as the others do? Have you ever heard him use his voice or say anything? Have you ever heard him utter a single beep or a single burble?" "Come to think of it, I never have," replied the cob, who was beginning to look worried. "Have you ever heard Louis say good night to us, as the others do? Have you ever heard him say good morning, as the others do in their charming little way, burbling and beeping?" "Now that you mention it, I never have," said the cob. "Goodness, what are you getting at? Do you wish me to believe that I have a son who is defective in any way? Such a revelation would distress me greatly. I want everything to go smoothly in my family life so that I can glide gracefully and serenely, now in the prime of my life, without being haunted by worry or disappointment. Fatherhood is quite a burden, at best. I do not want the added strain of having a defective child, a child that has something the matter with him." "Well," said the wife, "I've been watching Louis lately. It is my opinion that the little fellow can't talk. I've never heard him make one sound. I think he came into the world lacking a voice. If he had a voice, he'd use it, same as the others do." "Why, this is terrible," said the cob. "This is distressing beyond words. This is a very serious matter." His wife looked at him in amusement. "It's not too serious now," she said, "but it will be serious 2 or 3 years from now when Louis falls in love, as he will surely do. A young male swan will be greatly handicapped in finding a mate if he is unable to say "Coho, coho," or if he can't utter the usual endearments to the young female of his choice." "Are you sure?" asked the cob. "Certainly I'm sure," she replied. "I can remember perfectly well the springtime years ago when you fell in love with me and began chasing after me. What a sight you were, and what a lot of noise you made. It was in Montana, remember?" "Of course I remember," said the cob. "Well, the thing that attracted me most to you was your voice, your wonderful voice." "It was?" said the cob. "Yes, you had the finest, most powerful, most resonant voice of any of the young male swans in the Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge in Montana." "I did?" said the cob. "Yes, indeed. Every time I heard you say something in that deep voice of yours, I was ready to go anywhere with you." "You were?" said the cob. He was obviously delighted with his wife's praise. It tickled his vanity and made him feel great. He had always fancied himself as having a fine voice, and now to hear it from his wife's own lips was a real thrill. In the pleasure of the moment, he forgot all about Louis and thought entirely of himself. And of course, he did remember that enchanted springtime on the lake in Montana when he had fallen in love. He remembered how pretty the swan had been, how young and innocent she seemed, how attractive, how desirable. Now he realized fully that he would never have been able to woo her and win her if he had been unable to say anything. "We'll not worry about Louis for the time being," said the swan. "He's still very young. But we must watch him next winter when we are in Montana for the season. We must stay together as a family until we see how Louis makes out." She walked over to where her sleeping cygnets were and settled down next to them. The night was chill. Carefully, she lifted one wing and covered the cygnets with it. They stirred in their sleep and drew close to her. The cob stood quietly, thinking about what his wife had just told him. He was a brave, noble bird, and already he was beginning to work out a plan for his little son Louis. "If it's really true that Louis has no voice," said the cob to himself, "then I shall provide him with a device of some sort to enable him to make a lot of noise. There must be some way out of this difficulty. After all, my son is a trumpeter swan. He should have a voice like a trumpet. But first I will test him to make certain that what his mother says is true." The cob was unable to sleep that night. He stood on one leg quietly, but sleep never came. Next morning, after everyone had enjoyed a good breakfast, he led Louis apart from the others. "Louis," he said, "I wish to speak to you alone. Let's just you and I take a swim by ourselves to the other end of the pond where we can talk privately without being interrupted." Louis was surprised by this, but he nodded his head and followed his father, swimming strongly in his wake. He did not understand why his father wanted to speak to him alone, without his brothers and sisters. "Now," said the cob, when they reached the upper end of the pond, "here we are, gracefully floating, supremely buoyant, at some distance from the others, in perfect surroundings, a fine morning with the pond quiet except for the song of the blackbirds making the air sweet." "I wish my father would get to the point," thought Louis. "This is an ideal place for our conference," continued the cob. "There is something I feel I should discuss with you very candidly and openly, something that concerns your future. We need not range over the whole spectrum of bird life, but just confine our talk to the one essential thing that is before us on this unusual occasion." "Oh, I wish my father would get to the point," thought Louis, who by this time was getting very nervous. "It has come to my attention, Louis," continued the cob, "that you rarely say anything. In fact, I can't recall ever hearing you utter a sound. I have never heard you speak, or say "Coho," or cry out either in fear or in joy. This is most unusual for a young trumpeter. It is serious. Louis, let me hear you say beep. Go ahead, say it. Say beep." Poor Louis! While his father watched, he took a deep breath, opened his mouth, and let the air out, hoping it would say beep. But there wasn't a sound. "Try again, Louis," said his father. "Perhaps you're not making enough of an effort." Louis tried again. It was no use. No sound came from his throat. He shook his head sadly. "Watch me," said the cob. He raised his neck to its full height and cried "Coho!" so loud it was heard by every creature for miles around. "Now let me hear you go beep," he commanded. "Say beep, Louis, loud and clear." Louis tried. He couldn't beep. "Let me hear you burble. Go ahead and burble, like this. Burble, burble, burble." Louis tried to burble. He couldn't do it. No sound came. "Well," said the cob, "I guess it's no use. I guess you are dumb." When he heard the word dumb, Louis felt like crying. The cob saw that he had hurt Louis's feelings. "You misunderstand me, my son," he said in a comforting voice. "You fail to understand my use of the word dumb, which has two meanings. If I had called you dumb cluck or a dumb bunny, that would have meant that I had a poor opinion of your intelligence. Actually, I think you are perhaps the brightest, smartest, most intelligent of all my cygnets. Words sometimes have two meanings. The word dumb is such a word. A person who can't see is called blind. A person who can't hear is called deaf. A person who can't speak is called dumb. That simply means he can't say anything. Do you understand?" Louis nodded his head. He felt better, and he was grateful to his father for explaining that the word had two meanings. He still felt awfully unhappy, though. "Do not let an unusual sadness settle over you, Louis," said the cob. "Swans must be cheerful, not sad, graceful, not awkward, brave, not cowardly. Remember that the world is full of youngsters who have some sort of handicap that they must overcome. You apparently have a speech defect. I am sure you will overcome it in time. There may even be some slight advantage at your age in not being able to say anything. It compels you to be a good listener. The world is full of talkers, but it is rare to find anyone who listens. And I assure you that you can pick up more information when you are listening than when you are talking." "My father does quite a lot of talking himself," thought Louis. "Some people," continued the cob, "go through life chattering and making a lot of noise with their mouth. They never really listen to anything. They are too busy expressing their opinions, which are often unsound or based on bad information. Therefore, my son, be of good cheer. Enjoy life. Learn to fly. Eat well. Drink well. Use your ears. Use your eyes. and I promise that someday I will make it possible for you to use your voice. There are mechanical devices that convert air into beautiful sounds. One such device is called a trumpet. I saw a trumpet once in my travels. I think you may need a trumpet in order to live a full life. I've never known a trumpeter swan to need a trumpet, but your case is different. I intend to get you what you need. I don't know how I will manage this, but in the fullness of time it shall be accomplished. And now that our talk has come to a close, let us return gracefully to the other end of the pond where your mother and your brothers and sisters await us." The cob turned and swam off. Louis followed. It had been an unhappy morning for him. He felt frightened at being different from his brothers and sisters. It scared him to be different. He couldn't understand why he had come into the world without a voice. Everyone else seemed to have a voice. Why didn't he? "Fate is cruel," he thought. "Fate is cruel to me." Then he remembered that his father had promised to help, and he felt better. Soon they joined the others, and everyone started water games, and Louis joined in, dipping and splashing and diving and twisting. Louis could splash water farther than any of the others, but he couldn't shout while he was doing it. To be able to shout while you are splashing water is half the fun. Chapter 6. Off to Montana. At the end of the summer, the cob gathered his family around him and made an announcement. "Children," he began, "I have news for you. Summer is drawing to a close. Leaves are turning red, pink, and pale yellow. Soon the leaves will fall. The time has come for us to leave this pond. The time has come for us to go." "Go?" cried all the cygnets except Louis. "Certainly," replied their father. "You children are old enough to learn the facts of life, and the principal fact of our life right now is this: we can't stay in this marvelous location much longer." "Why not?" cried all the cygnets except Louis. "Because summer is over," said the cob, "and it's the way of swans to leave their nesting site at summer's end and travel south to a milder place where the food supply is good. I know that you are all fond of this pretty pond, this marvelous marsh, these reedy shores and restful retreats. You have found life pleasant and amusing here. You have learned to dive and swim underwater. You have enjoyed our daily recreational trips when we formed in line, myself in front swimming gracefully like a locomotive, and your charming mother bringing up the rear like a caboose. Day long you have listened and learned. You have avoided the odious otter and the cruel coyote. You have listened to the little owl that says, "Coo, coo, coo, coo." You have heard the partridge say, "Quit, quit." At night you have dropped off to sleep to the sound of frogs, the voices of the night. But these pleasures and pastimes, these adventures, these games and frolics, these beloved sights and sounds must come to an end. All things come to an end. It is time for us to go. "Where will we go?" cried all the cygnets except Louis. "Where will we go? Coho, coho! Where will we go? Coho, coho!" "We will fly south to Montana," replied the cob. "What is Montana?" asked all the cygnets except Louis. "What is Montana? Banana, banana! What is Montana? Banana, banana!" "Montana," said their father, "is a state of the Union, and there in a lovely valley surrounded by high mountains are the red rock lakes, which nature has designed especially for swans. In these lakes you will enjoy warm water arising from hidden springs. Here ice never forms, no matter how cold the nights. In the red rock lakes you will find other trumpeter swans as well as the lesser waterfowl, the geese and the ducks. There are few enemies, no gunners, plenty of muskrat houses, free grain, games every day. What more can a swan ask in the long, long cold of winter?" Louis listened to all this in amazement. He wanted to ask his father how they would learn to fly, and how they would find Montana even after they learned to fly. He began to worry about getting lost, but he wasn't able to ask any questions. He just had to listen. One of his brothers spoke up. "Father," he said, "you said we would fly south. I don't know how to fly. I've never been up in the air." "True," replied the cob, "but flying is largely a matter of having the right attitude, plus, of course, good wing feathers. Flying consists of 3 parts. First, the takeoff, during which there is a lot of fuss and commotion, a lot of splashing and rapid beating of the wings. Second, the ascent, or gaining of altitude. This requires hard work and fast wing action. Third, the leveling off, the steady, elevated flight, high in air, wings beating slower now, beating strongly and regularly, carrying us swiftly and surely from zone to zone as we _𝐓𝐽, 𝐓𝐽, with all the earth stretched out far below. It sounds very nice, said the cygnet, but I'm not sure I can do it. I might get dizzy way up there if I look down. Don't look down, said his father. Look straight ahead, and don't lose your nerve. Besides, swans do not get dizzy. They feel wonderful in the air. They feel exalted. What does exalted mean? Asked the cygnet. It means you will feel strong, glad, firm, high, proud, successful, satisfied, powerful, and elevated, as though you had conquered life and had a high purpose. Louis listened to all this with great attention. The idea of flying frightened him. I won't be able to say 𝐓𝐽, he thought. I wonder whether a swan can fly if he has no voice and can't say 𝐓𝐽. I think, said the cob, the best plan is for me to demonstrate flying to you. I will make a short exhibition flight while you watch. Observe everything I do. Watch me pump my neck up and down before the takeoff. Watch me test the wind by turning my head this way and that. The takeoff must be into the wind. It's much easier that way. Listen to the noise I make trumpeting. Watch how I raise my great wings. See how I beat them furiously as I rush through the water with my feet going like mad. This frenzy will last for a couple of 100 feet, at which point I will suddenly be airborne, my wings still chopping the air with terrific force, but my feet no longer touching the water. Then watch what I do. Watch how I stretch my long, white, elegant neck out ahead of me until it has reached its full length. Watch how I retract my feet and allow them to stream out behind, full length, until they extend beyond my tail. Hear my cries as I gain the upper air and start trumpeting. See how strong and steady my wing beat has become. Then watch me bank and turn, set my wings, and glide down. And just as I reach the pond again, watch how I shoot my feet out in front of me and use them for the splashdown as though they were a pair of water skis. Having watched all this, then you can join me, and your mother too, and we will all make a practice flight together until you get the hang of it. Then tomorrow we will do it again, and instead of returning to the pond, we will head south to Montana. Are you ready for my exhibition flight? Ready! Cried all the cygnets except Louis. Very well, here I go, cried the cob. As the others watched, he swam downwind to the end of the pond, turned, tested the wind, pumped his neck up and down, trumpeted, and after a rush of 200 feet, got into the air and began gaining altitude. His long white neck stretched out ahead. His big black feet stretched out behind. His wings had great power. The beat slowed as he settled into sustained flight. All eyes watched. Louis was more excited than he had ever been. I wonder if I can really do it, he thought. Suppose I fail. Then the others will fly away and I will be left here all alone on this deserted pond with winter approaching, with no father, no mother, no sisters, no brothers, and no food to eat when the pond freezes over. I will die of starvation. I'm scared. In a few minutes, the cob glided down out of the sky and skidded to a stop on the pond. They all cheered, 𝐓𝐽, 𝐓𝐽, beep, 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 beep. All but Louis. He had to express his approval simply by beating his wings and splashing water in his father's face. All right, said the cob, you've seen how it's done. Follow me and we'll give it a try. Extend yourselves to the utmost. Do everything in the proper order. Never forget for a minute that you are swans and therefore excellent flyers, and I'm sure all will be well. They all swam downwind to the end of the pond. They pumped their necks up and down. Louis pumped his harder than any of the others. They tested the wind by turning their heads this way and that. Suddenly the cob signaled for the start. There was a tremendous commotion, wings beating, feet racing, water churned to a froth. And presently, wonder of wonders, there were 7 swans in the air, 2 pure white ones and 5 dirty gray ones. The takeoff was accomplished, and they started gaining altitude. Louis was the first of the young cygnets to become airborne, ahead of all his brothers and sisters. The minute his feet lifted clear of the water, he knew he could fly. It was a tremendous relief, as well as a splendid sensation. "Boy," he said to himself, "I never knew flying could be such fun. This is great. This is sensational. This is superb. I feel exalted, and I'm not dizzy. I'll be able to get to Montana with the rest of the family. I may be defective, but at least I can fly." The 7 great birds stayed aloft about half an hour, then returned to the pond, the cob still in the lead. They all had a drink to celebrate the successful flight. Next day they were up early. It was a beautiful fall morning, with mist rising from the pond and the trees shining in all colors. Toward the end of the afternoon, as the sun sank low in the sky, the swans took off from the pond and began their journey to Montana. "This way!" cried the cob. He swung to his left and straightened out on a southerly course. The others followed, trumpeting as they went. As they passed over the camp where Sam Beaver was, Sam heard them and ran out. He stood watching as they grew smaller and smaller in the distance and finally disappeared. "What was it?" asked his father when Sam returned indoors. "Swans," replied Sam. "They're headed south." "We'd better do the same," said Mr. Beaver. "I think Shorty will be here tomorrow to take us out." Mr. Beaver lay down on his bunk. "What kind of swans were they?" he asked. "Trumpeters," said Sam. "That's funny," said Mr. Beaver. "I thought trumpeter swans had quit migrating. I thought they spent the whole year on the Red Rock Lakes where they are protected." "Most of 'em do," replied Sam, "but not all of 'em." It was bedtime. Sam got out his diary. This is what he wrote. "I heard the swans tonight. They are headed south. It must be wonderful to fly at night. I wonder whether I'll ever see one of them again. How does a bird know how to get from where he is to where he wants to be?" Chapter 7. School Days. A few days after the swans arrived at their winter home on the Red Rock Lakes, Louis had an idea. He decided that since he was unable to use his voice, he should learn to read and write. "If I'm defective in one respect," he said to himself, "I should try and develop myself along other lines. I will learn to read and write. Then I will hang a small slate around my neck and carry a chalk and pencil. In that way, I will be able to communicate with anybody who can read." Louis liked company, and he already had many friends on the lakes. The place was a refuge for water birds, swans, geese, ducks, and other waterfowl. They lived there because it was a safe place and because the water stayed warm even in the coldest winter weather. Louis was greatly admired for his ability as a swimmer. He liked to compete with other cygnets to see who could swim underwater the greatest distance and stay down the longest. When Louis had finally made up his mind about learning to read and write, he decided to visit Sam Beaver and get help from him. "Perhaps," thought Louis, "Sam will let me go to school with him and the teacher will show me how to write." The idea excited him. He wondered whether a young swan would be accepted in a classroom of children. He wondered whether it was hard to learn to read. Most of all, he wondered whether he could find Sam. Montana is a big state, and he wasn't even sure Sam lived in Montana, but he hoped he did. Next morning, when his parents were not looking, Louis took off into the air. He flew northeast. When he came to Yellowstone River, he followed it to the sweet grass country. When he saw a town beneath him, he landed next to the schoolhouse and waited for the boys and girls to be let out. Louis looked at every boy, hoping to see Sam, but Sam wasn't there. "Wrong town, wrong school," thought Louis. "I'll try again." He flew off, found another town, and located the school, but all the boys and girls had gone home for the day. "I'll just have a look around anyway," thought Louis. He didn't dare walk down the main street for fear somebody would shoot him. Instead, he took to the air and circled around, flying low and looking carefully at every boy in sight. After about 10 minutes, he saw a ranch house where a boy was splitting wood near the kitchen door. The boy had black hair. Louis glided down. "I'm lucky," he thought. "It's Sam." When Sam saw the swan, he laid down his axe and stood perfectly still. Louis walked up timidly, then reached down and untied Sam's shoelace. "Hello," said Sam in a friendly voice. Louis tried to say "Coho," but not a sound came from his throat. "I know you," said Sam. "You're the one that never said anything and used to pull my shoelaces." Louis nodded. "I'm glad to see you," said Sam. "What can I do for you?" Louis just stared straight ahead. "Are you hungry?" asked Sam. Louis shook his head. "Thirsty?" Louis shook his head. "Do you want to stay overnight with us here at the ranch?" asked Sam. Louis nodded his head and jumped up and down. "Okay," said Sam. "We have plenty of room. It's just a question of getting my father's permission." Sam picked up his axe, laid a stick of wood on the chopping block, and split the stick neatly down the middle. He looked at Louis. "There's something wrong with your voice, isn't there?" he asked. Louis nodded, pumping his neck up and down hard. He knew Sam was his friend, although he didn't know that Sam had once saved his mother's life. In a few minutes, Mr. Beaver rode into the yard on a cow pony. He got off and tied his pony to a rail. "What have you got there?" he asked Sam. "It's a young trumpeter swan," said Sam. "He's only a few months old. Will you let me keep him a while?" "Well," said Mr. Beaver, "I think it's against the law to hold one of these wild birds in captivity, but I'll phone the game warden and see what he says. If he says yes, you can keep him. Tell the warden the swan has something the matter with him," called Sam as his father started toward the house. "What's wrong with him?" asked his father. "He has a speech problem," replied Sam. "Something's wrong with his throat." "What are you talking about? Who ever heard of a swan with a speech problem?" "Well," said Sam, "this is a trumpeter swan that can't trumpet. He's defective. He can't make a sound." Mr. Beaver looked at his son as though he didn't know whether to believe him or not. But he went into the house. In a few minutes he came back. "The warden says you can keep the young swan here for a while if you can help him. But sooner or later the bird will have to go back to the Red Rock Lakes where he belongs. The warden said he wouldn't just let anybody have a young swan, but he'd let you have one because you understand about birds and he trusts you." "That's quite a compliment, son." Mr. Beaver looked pleased. Sam looked happy. Louis was greatly relieved. After a while, everyone went in to supper in the kitchen of the ranch house. Mrs. Beaver allowed Louis to stand beside Sam's chair. They fed him some corn and some oats, which tasted good. When Sam was ready for bed, he wanted Louis to sleep in his room with him. But Mrs. Beaver said no. "He'll mess up the room. He's no canary. He's enormous. Put the bird out in the barn. He can sleep in one of the empty stalls. The horses won't mind." Next morning, Sam took Louis to school with him. Sam rode his pony and Louis flew along. At the schoolhouse, the other children were amazed to see this great bird with his long neck, bright eyes, and big feet. Sam introduced him to the teacher of the first grade, Mrs. 𝐓𝐫𝐻𝐻𝐿, who was short and fat. Sam explained that Louis wanted to read and write because he was unable to make any sound with his throat. Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐻𝐻𝐿 stared at Louis. Then she shook her head. "No birds," she said. "I've got enough trouble." Sam looked disappointed. "Please, Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐻𝐿," he said, "please let him stand in your class and learn to read and write." "Why does a bird need to read and write?" replied the teacher. "Only people need to communicate with one another." "That's not quite true, Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐻𝐿," said Sam. "If you'll excuse me for saying so, I have watched birds and animals a great deal. All birds and animals talk to one another. They really have to in order to get along. Mothers have to talk to their young. Males have to talk to females, particularly in the spring of the year when they are in love." "In love?" said Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐻𝐿, who seemed to perk up at this suggestion. "What do you know about love?" Sam blushed. "What kind of a bird is he?" she asked. "He's a young trumpeter swan," said Sam. "Right now he's sort of a dirty gray color, but in another year he'll be the most beautiful thing you ever saw, pure white with black bill and black feet. He was hatched last spring in Canada and now lives in the Red Rock Lakes, but he can't say coho the way the other swans can, and this puts him at a terrible disadvantage." "Why?" asked the teacher. "Because it does," said Sam. "If you wanted to say coho and couldn't make a single solitary sound, wouldn't you feel worried?" "I don't want to say coho," replied the teacher. "I don't even know what it means." Anyway, this is all just foolishness, Sam. What makes you think a bird can learn to read and write? It's impossible. Give him a chance, pleaded Sam. He is well behaved, and he's bright, and he's got this very serious speech defect. What's his name? I don't know, replied Sam. Well, said Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐿𝐼𝐼, if he's coming into my class, he's got to have a name. Maybe we can find out what it is. She looked at the bird. Is your name Joe? Louis shook his head. Jonathan? Louis shook his head. Donald? Louis shook his head again. Is your name Louis? asked Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐿𝐼. Louis nodded his head very hard and jumped up and down and flapped his wings. Great Caesar's ghost! Cried the teacher. Look at those wings! Well, his name is Louis, that's for sure. All right, Louis, you may join the class. Stand right here by the blackboard. And don't mess up the room either. If you need to go outdoors for any reason, raise one wing. Louis nodded. The first graders cheered. They liked the looks of the new pupil and were eager to see what he could do. Quiet, children, said Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐿𝐼 sternly. We'll start with the letter A. She picked up a piece of chalk and made a big A on the blackboard. Now you try it, Louis. Louis grabbed a piece of chalk in his bill and drew a perfect A right under the one the teacher had drawn. You see, said Sam, he's an unusual bird. Well, said Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐿𝐼, A is easy. I'll give him something harder. She wrote cat on the board. Let's see you write cat, Louis. Louis wrote cat. Well, cat is easy too, muttered the teacher. Cat is easy because it's short. Can anyone think of a word that is longer than cat? Catastrophe, said Charlie Nelson, who sat in the first row. Good, said Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐿𝐼. That's a good hard word. But does anyone know what it means? What is a catastrophe? An earthquake, said one of the girls. Correct, replied the teacher. What else? War is a catastrophe, said Charlie Nelson. Correct, replied Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐿𝐼. What else is? A very small red-headed girl named Jenny raised her hand. Yes, Jenny, what is a catastrophe? In a very small, high voice, Jenny said, When you get ready to go on a picnic with your father and mother and you make peanut butter sandwiches and jelly rolls and put them in a thermos box with bananas and an apple and some raisin cookies and some paper napkins and some bottles of pop and a few hard-boiled eggs, and then you put the thermos box in your car, and just as you're starting out it starts to rain and your parents say there is no point in having a picnic in the rain. That's a catastrophe. Very good, Jenny, said Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐿𝐼. It isn't as bad as an earthquake, and it isn't as bad as war, but when a picnic gets called on account of rain, it is a catastrophe for a child, I guess. Anyway, catastrophe is a good word. No bird can write that word, I'll bet. If I can teach a bird to write catastrophe, it'll be big news all over the sweetgrass country. I'll get my picture in Life magazine. I'll be famous. Thinking of all these things, she stepped to the blackboard and wrote catastrophe. Okay, Louis, let's see you write that. Louis picked up a fresh piece of chalk in his bill. He was scared. He took a good look at the word. A long word, he thought, is really no harder than a short one. I'll just copy one letter at a time and pretty soon it will be finished. Besides, my life is a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe to be without a voice. Then he began writing. Catastrophe, he wrote, making each letter very neatly. When he got to the last letter, the pupils clapped and stamped their feet and banged on their desks, and one boy quickly made a paper airplane and zoomed it into the air. Mrs. 𝐓𝐵𝐿𝐼 rapped for order. Very good, Louis, she said. Sam, it's time you went to your own classroom. You shouldn't be in my room. Go and join the 5th grade. I'll take care of your friend the Swan. Back in his own room, Sam sat down at his desk feeling very happy about the way things had turned out. The 5th graders were having a lesson in arithmetic, and their teacher, Miss Annie Snug, greeted Sam with a question. Miss Snug was young and pretty. Sam, if a man can walk 3 miles in 1 hour, how many miles can he walk in 4 hours? It would depend on how tired he got after the first hour, replied Sam. The other pupils roared. Miss Snug rapped for order. "Sam is quite right," she said. "I never looked at the problem that way before. I always supposed that man could walk 12 miles in 4 hours. But Sam may be right. That man may not feel so spunky after the first hour. He may drag his feet. He may slow up." Albert Bigelow raised his hand. "My father knew a man who tried to walk 12 miles and he died of heart failure," said Albert. "Goodness," said the teacher. "I suppose that could happen too." "Anything can happen in 4 hours," said Sam. "A man might develop a blister on his heel, or he might find some berries growing along the road and stop to pick them. That would slow him up even if he wasn't tired or didn't have a blister." "It would indeed," agreed the teacher. "Well, children, I think we have all learned a great deal about arithmetic this morning, thanks to Sam Beaver. And now here is a problem for one of the girls in the room. If you are feeding a baby from a bottle, and you give the baby 8 ounces of milk in one feeding, how many ounces of milk would the baby drink in 2 feedings?" Linda Staples raised her hand. "About 15 ounces, she said. "Why is that?" asked Miss Snug. "Why wouldn't the baby drink 16 ounces?" "Because he spills a little each time," said Linda. "It runs out of the corners of his mouth and gets on his mother's apron." By this time the class was howling so loudly the arithmetic lesson had to be abandoned, but everyone had learned how careful you have to be when dealing with figures. Chapter 8. Love. When Louis's father and mother discovered that Louis was missing, they felt awful. No other young swan had disappeared from the lakes, only Louis. "The question now arises," said the cob to his wife, "whether or not I should go and look for our son. I am disinclined to leave these attractive lakes now, in the fall of the year, with winter coming on. I have, in fact, been looking forward to this time of serenity and peace and the society of other waterfowl. I like the life here." "There's another little matter to consider besides your personal comfort," said his wife. "Has it occurred to you that we have no idea which direction Louis went when he left? You don't know where he went any more than I do. If you were to start out looking for him, which way would you fly?" "Well," replied the cob, "in the last analysis, I believe I would go south." "What do you mean, in the last analysis?" said the swan impatiently. "You haven't analyzed anything. Why do you say, 'in the last analysis'? And why do you pick south as the way to go looking for Louis? There are other directions. There's north and east and west. There's northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest." "True," replied the cob, "and there are all those in-between directions. North-northeast, east-southeast, west-southwest. There's north by east and east by north. There's south-southeast, a half east, and there's a west by north, a half north. The directions a young swan could start off in are almost too numerous to think about." So it was decided that no search would be made. "We'll just wait here and see what happens," said the cob. "I feel sure Louis will return in the fullness of time." Months went by. Winter came to the Red Rock Lakes. The nights were long and dark and cold. The days were short and bright and cold. Sometimes the wind blew, but the swans and geese and ducks were safe and happy. The warm springs that fed the lakes kept the ice from covering them. There were always open places. There was plenty of food. Sometimes a man would arrive with a bag of grain and spread the grain where the birds could get it. Spring followed winter. Summer followed spring. A year went by, and it was springtime again. Still no sign of Louis. Then one morning, when Louis's grown-up brothers were playing a game of water polo, one of them looked up and saw a swan approaching in the sky. "Coho!" cried the cygnet. He rushed to his father and mother. "Look! Look! Look!" All the waterfowl on the lake turned and gazed up at the approaching swan. The swan circled in the sky. "It's Louis!" said the cob. "But what is that peculiar little object hanging around his neck by a string? What is that?" "Wait and see," said his wife. "Maybe it's a gift." Louis looked down from the sky and spotted what looked like his family. When he was sure, he glided down and skidded to a stop. His mother rushed up and embraced him. His father arched his neck gracefully and raised his wings in greeting. Everyone shouted, "Coho!" and "Welcome back, Louis!" His family was overjoyed. He had been gone for a year and a half, almost 18 months. He looked older and handsomer. His feathers were pure white now, instead of a dirty gray. Hanging by a cord around his neck was a small slate. Attached to the slate by a piece of string was a white chalk pencil. When the family greetings were over, Louis seized the chalk in his bill and wrote, "Hi there," on the slate. He held the slate out eagerly for all to see. The cob stared at it. The mother swan stared at it. The cygnets stared at it. They just stared and stared. Words on a slate meant nothing to them. They couldn't read. None of the members of his family had ever seen a slate before, or a piece of chalk. Louis's attempt to greet his family was a failure. He felt as though he had wasted a year and a half by going to school and learning to write. He felt keenly disappointed. And of course, he was unable to speak. The words on the slate were all he could offer by way of greeting. Finally, his father the cob spoke up. "Louis, my son," he began in his deep, resonant voice, "this is the day we have long awaited, the day of your return to our sanctuary in the Red Rock Lakes. No one can imagine the extent of our joy or the depth of our emotion at seeing you again, you who have been absent from our midst for so long, in lands we know not of, in pursuits we can only guess at. How good it is to see your countenance again. We hope you've enjoyed good health during your long absence, in lands we know not of, in pursuits we can only guess at." "You've said that once already," said his wife. "You're repeating yourself. Louis must be tired after his trip, no matter where he's been or what he's been up to." "Very true," said the cob, "but I must prolong my welcoming remarks a bit longer, for my curiosity is aroused by that odd little object Louis is wearing around his neck, and by the strange symbols he has placed upon it by rubbing that white thing up and down and leaving those strange white tracings." "Well," said Louis's mother, "we're all interested in it naturally. But Louis can't explain it because he is defective and can't talk. So we'll just have to forget our curiosity for the moment and let Louis take a bath and have dinner." Everyone agreed this was a good idea. Louis swam to the shore, placed his slate and his chalk pencil under a bush, and took a bath. When he was through, he dipped the end of one wing in the water and sorrowfully rubbed out the words, "Hi there." Then he hung the slate around his neck again. It felt good to be home with his family, and his family had increased during the months he had spent with Sam Beaver at school. There were now 6 new cygnets. Louis's father and mother had spent the summer on a trip to Canada, and while there they had nested and hatched 6 little cygnets, and in the fall they had all joined up again at the Red Rock Lakes in Montana. One day, soon after Louis's return, the grain man stopped by with a sack of grain. Louis saw him and swam over. When the man spread the grain on the ground to feed the birds, Louis took off his slate and wrote, "Thank you very much." He held the slate up to the man, who appeared surprised. "Say," said the man, "you're quite a bird. Where did you learn to write?" Louis erased the slate and wrote, "At school." "School?" said the grain man. "What school?" "Public school," wrote Louis. "Mrs. Hammerbotham taught me." "Never heard of her," said the grain man, "but she must be a darned good teacher." "She is," wrote Louis. He was overjoyed to be carrying on a conversation with a stranger. He realized that even though the slate was no help with other birds, it was going to be a help with people, because people could read. This made him feel a whole lot better. Sam Beaver had given Louis the slate as a goodbye present when he left the ranch. Sam had bought the slate and the chalk pencil with money he had saved. Louis decided he would always carry them with him, no matter where he went in the world. The grain man wondered whether he had been dreaming or whether he had really seen a swan write words on a slate. He decided to say nothing about it to anyone, for fear people might think he was crazy in the head. For birds, spring is the time to find a mate. The warm, sweet airs of spring stir strange feelings in young swans. The males begin to notice the females. They show off in front of them. The females begin to notice the males too, but they pretend they are not noticing anything at all. They act very coy. Louis felt so queer one day he knew he must be in love, and he knew which bird he was in love with. Whenever he swam past her, he could feel his heart beat faster, and his mind was full of thoughts of love and desire. He thought he had never seen such a beautiful young female swan. She was a trifle smaller than the others, and she seemed to have a more graceful neck and more attractive ways than any of his other friends on the lake. Her name was Serena. He wished he could do something to attract her attention. He wanted her for his mate, but was unable to tell her so because he couldn't make a sound. He swam in circles around her and pumped his neck up and down and made a great show of diving and staying down to prove he could hold his breath longer than any other bird. But the little female paid no attention to Lewis's antics. She pretended he didn't exist. When Lewis's mother found out that Lewis was courting a young female, she hid behind some bulrushes and watched what was going on. She could tell that he was in love by the way he acted, and she saw that he was having no success. Once, in desperation, Lewis swam up to Serena, his beloved, and made a bow. His slate, as usual, was around his neck. Taking the chalk pencil in his mouth, he wrote, "I love you," on the slate and showed it to her. She stared at it for a moment, then swam away. She didn't know how to read, and although she rather liked the looks of a young cob who had something hanging around his neck, she couldn't really get interested in a bird that was unable to say anything. A trumpeter swan that couldn't trumpet was a bust as far as she was concerned. When Lewis's mother saw this, she went to her husband the cob. "I have news for you," she said. "Your son Lewis is in love, and the swan of his choice, the female of his desiring, pays no attention to him. It's just as I predicted. Lewis won't be able to get a mate because he has no voice. That snippety little female he's chasing after gives me a pain in the neck the way she acts. But just the same, I'm sorry for Lewis. He thinks she's the greatest thing on the lake, and he can't say, 'Coho, I love you.' And that's what she's waiting to hear." "Why, this is terrible news," said the cob. "News of the most serious import. I know what it is like to be in love. Well do I remember how painful love can be, how exciting, and in the event of unsuccess, how disappointing and doleful the days and nights. But I am Lewis's father, and I'm not going to take this situation lying down. I shall act. Lewis is a trumpeter swan, noblest of all the waterfowl. He is gay, cheerful, strong, powerful, lusty, good, brave, handsome, reliable, trustworthy, a great flyer, a tremendous swimmer, fearless, patient, loyal, true, ambitious, desirous." "Just a minute," said his wife. "You don't need to tell me all these things. The point is, what are you going to do to help Lewis get himself a mate?" "I'm leading up to that in my own graceful way," replied the cob. "You say that what this young female wants is to hear Lewis say, 'Coho, I love you.'" "That's right." "Then she shall hear it," exclaimed the cob. "There are devices made by men, horns, trumpets, musical instruments of all sorts. These devices are capable of producing sounds similar to the wild sound of our trumpeting. I shall begin a search for such a device, and if I have to go to the ends of the earth to find a trumpet for our young son, I shall find it at last and bring it home to Lewis." "Well, if I may make a suggestion," said his wife, "don't go to the ends of the earth. Go to Billings, Montana. It's nearer." "Very well, I will try Billings. I shall look for a trumpet in Billings. And now, without further ado, I go. There is no time to lose. Springtime doesn't last forever. Love is fleeting. Every minute counts. I'm leaving this instant for Billings, Montana, a great city teeming with life and with objects made by man. Goodbye, my love. I shall return." "What are you going to use for money?" asked his practical wife. "Trumpets cost money." "Leave that to me," replied the cob. And with that, he took off into the air. He climbed steeply like a jet plane, then leveled off, flying high and fast toward the northeast. His wife watched him until he was out of sight. "What a swan," she murmured. "I just hope he knows what he's doing." Chapter 9. The Trumpet. As the cob flew toward Billings on his powerful white wings, all sorts of troublesome thoughts whirled in his head. The cob had never gone looking for a trumpet before. He had no money to pay for a trumpet. He feared he might arrive after the shops had closed for the day. He realized that in the whole continent of North America, he was undoubtedly the only trumpeter swan who was on his way to a city to get a trumpet. "This is a queer adventure," he said to himself, "yet it is a noble quest. I will do anything to help my son Louis, even if I run into real trouble." Toward the end of the afternoon, the cob looked ahead and in the distance saw the churches and factories and shops and homes of Billings. He decided to act quickly and boldly. He circled the city once, looking for a music store. Suddenly he spied one. It had a very big, wide window, solid glass. The cob flew lower and circled so he could get a better look. He gazed into the store. He saw a drum painted gold. He saw a fancy guitar with an electric cord. He saw a small piano. He saw banjos, horns, violins, mandolins, cymbals, saxophones, marimbaphones, cellos, and many other instruments. Then he saw what he wanted. He saw a brass trumpet hanging by a red cord. "Now is my time to act," he said to himself. "Now is my moment for risking everything on one bold move. However shocking it may be to my sensibilities, however offensive it may be to the laws that govern the lives of men. Here I go! May good luck go with me!" With that, the old cob set his wings for a dive. He aimed straight at the big window. He held his neck straight and stiff, waiting for the crash. He dove swiftly and hit the window going full speed. The glass broke. The noise was terrific. The whole store shook. Musical instruments fell to the floor. Glass flew everywhere. A salesgirl fainted. The cob felt a twinge of pain as a jagged piece of broken glass cut into his shoulder, but he grabbed the trumpet in his beak, turned sharply in the air, flew back through the hole in the window, and began climbing fast over the roofs of Billings. A few drops of blood fell to the ground below. His shoulder hurt, but he had succeeded in getting what he had come for. Held firmly in his bill, its red cord dangling, was a beautiful brass trumpet. You can imagine the noise in the music store when the cob crashed through the window. At the moment the glass broke, one of the clerks was showing a bass drum to a customer, and the clerk was so startled at seeing a big white bird come flying through the window, he hit the drum with a tremendous wallop. Boom! Went the drum. Crash! Went the splinters of flying glass. When the salesgirl fainted, she fell against the keys of a piano. Blah! Went the piano. The owner of the store grabbed his shotgun, which went off by mistake, blasting a hole in the ceiling and sending down a shower of plaster. Everything was flying around and falling and making a noise. Boom! Went the drum. Plunk! Went the banjo. Went the piano. Oomp! Went the fiddle. Help! Screamed a clerk. We've been robbed! Make way! Shouted the owner. He ran for the door, stepped outside, and fired another shot. Bang! At the disappearing bird. His shot was too late. The cob was safe in the sky, beyond the range of gunfire. He was headed home toward the southwest, high above the roofs and spires of Billings. In his beak was the trumpet. In his heart was the pain of having committed a crime. "I have robbed a store," he said to himself. "I have become a thief. What a miserable fate for a bird of my excellent character and high ideals. Why did I do this? What led me to commit this awful crime? My past life has been blameless, a model of good behavior and correct conduct. I am by nature law-abiding. Why, oh, why did I do this?" Then the answer came to him as he flew steadily on through the evening sky. "I did it to help my son. I did it for love of my son Louis." Back in Billings, the news spread rapidly. This was the first time a swan had broken into a music store and made off with a trumpet. A lot of people refused to believe it had happened. The editor of the newspaper sent a reporter to the store to look around. The reporter interviewed the owner and wrote an article about the event for the paper. The article was headed, "Large bird breaks into music store. White swan crashes through window and makes off with valuable trumpet." Everybody in Billings bought a copy of the paper and read all about the extraordinary event. It was talked about all over town. Some people believed it. Others said it never could have happened. They said the store owner had just invented it to get some publicity for his store. but the clerks in the store agreed that it had really happened. They pointed to the drops of blood on the floor. The police came to look over the damage, which was estimated at $900. The police promised they would try to find the thief and arrest him, but the police were sorry to hear that the thief was a bird. Birds are a special problem, they said. Birds are hard to deal with. Back at the Red Rock Lakes, Louis's mother waited anxiously for her husband to return. When he showed up in the night sky, she saw that he had a trumpet with him. It was slung around his neck by its cord. "Well," she said, as he glided to a stop in the water, "I see you made it." "I did, my dear," said the cob. "I traveled fast and far, sacrificed my honor, and I have returned. Where is Louis? I want to give him this trumpet right away." "He's over there sitting on a muskrat house, dreaming about that empty-headed young female he's so crazy about." The cob swam over to his son and made a presentation speech. "Louis," he said, "I have been on a journey to the haunts of men. I visited a great city teeming with life and commerce. Whilst there, I picked up a gift for you, which I now bestow upon you with my love and my blessing. Here, Louis, is a trumpet. It will be your voice, a substitute for the voice God failed to give you. Learn to blow it, Louis, and life will be smoother and richer and gayer for you. With the help of this horn, you will be able at last to say, 'Ko-ho!' like every other swan. The sound of music will be in our ears. You will be able to attract the attention of desirable young females. Master this trumpet, and you will be able to play love songs for them, filling them with ardor and surprise and longing. I hope it will bring you happiness, Louis, and a new and better life. I procured it at some personal sacrifice to myself and my pride, but we won't go into that now. The long and short of it is, I had no money. I took the trumpet without paying for it. This was deplorable. But the important thing is that you learn to play the instrument." So saying, the cob removed the trumpet from around his neck and hung it on Louis, alongside the slate and the white chalk pencil. "Wear it in good health," he said. "Blow it in happiness. Make the woods and the hills and the marshes echo with the sounds of your youthful desire." Louis wanted to thank his father, but he was unable to say a word. And he knew it would do no good to write "thank you" on the slate, because his father wouldn't be able to read it, never having had an education. So Louis just bobbed his head and waggled his tail and fluttered his wings. The cob knew by these signs that he had found favor in the sight of his son, and that the gift of a trumpet was acceptable.